Hello, and welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas into what it means to live as a follower of Jesus in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today I'm welcoming G. Jeffrey MacDonald. The Reverend G. Jeffrey MacDonald helps mainline Protestant congregations develop fresh vitality without full-time clergy. He does this through service journalism, authoring books, consulting with church leaders, and serving as a part-time interim pastor. Ordained in the United Church of Christ, Jeff has won national awards for his religion coverage in the Christian Science Monitor, Religion News Service, Faith and Leadership, and other outlets. He's the author of Thieves in the Temple, The Christian Church and the Selling of the American Soul, and what we'll be talking about today, Part-Time is Plenty, Thriving Without Full-Time Clergy. He lives in Swampscott, Massachusetts. Welcome to the show, Jeff. What else would you like our listeners to know about you?
Well, to explain a little, Lauren, of where I'm coming from in the work that I do, I have found over the course of doing journalism and ministry that there are really thousands of congregations out there, mainline Protestant congregations that have part-time clergy, but have not really mastered at all how to do that well. They have, in many cases, done so unwittingly, gone to part-time clergy, or have at the very least, not been very planned or strategic about it. And so they are grasping for insight into how to do it. And the denominations, when I talk with the leaders there, I often get shoulder shrugs and an admission that they don't know how to do it well either, because they're all geared toward a different model. And so that has really driven me to focus my journalism and my ministry work and my consulting work in this area to draw on the knowledge that is out there. There is quite a bit of lived knowledge among practitioners. It just doesn't make its way to the surface all the time. It doesn't get shared effectively and turned into practical insights and know-how. And so I aim to provide a bit of a conduit for all of that and enable the stories that we need to learn from to get to the surface and then begin a learning process and be a facilitator of that. So that's the concept behind or driving a lot of my work these days.
Great. Let's talk a little bit about your faith journey, if you don't mind sharing. Tell our listeners kind of how you came to the faith and what that looks like today.
Well, I grew up with a Christian family and with instruction in that direction, and participating in Sunday school, and coming from two different backgrounds, as with many, a congregational side of my family and a Lutheran side. And it was the Lutheran side that ended up having a good bit of influence, even though I'm now UCC congregational clergy. My mom is from the Lutheran side and helped me gain a real basis in that direction, being confirmed a Lutheran in my teenage years, and coming back to it later. Like many, I in high school and college did not really engage my faith. I wandered and explored a lot of other things, and I came back to it in an intentional way in my mid-20s as I was focusing and really kind of going through some transitions, soul searching, and thinking about what I was called to do. And so I have come to that as an adult, and have owned this path, and in that way I responded to a sense of calling in my 20s that led me to explore further, to focus my journalism, refocus it from business and politics to religion, and to also go back to school and discover that I could serve the church by being ordained and still continue to be a journalist. And so that's what's opened the door to me when I put two and two together and realized I could do both if I served the church part-time. It really was clear to me that that's a calling I could do long-term, and stepped into it.
Yeah, awesome. What are some spiritual practices that have been meaningful for you?
Well, one is walking, sort of. I call it like a meditative walking, and I didn't quite see it as a spiritual practice at first, but I do now. That I kind of load up my brain with it sometimes with scripture, spiritual reading, or and it might not be a lot of reading, but sometimes it's just a passage or two, and it's almost like Lectio Divina, but on foot, and so I will kind of load up with a passage, spend some time reading it through a few times, maybe read a little context, but sometimes just pack it in my brain so it's good and familiar. And then I walk along. I live near the beach in Massachusetts, and I can walk sometimes 7 or 8 miles, and and that's on the longer side. A lot of times I just go for about 3 miles, but it's a discipline to kind of keep my brain, or keep my mental focus on what I'm hearing in that scripture, and what to do with it. And so that's really been nourishing. The act of moving. I'm convinced that Socrates was onto something with walking with his students. They would go up into the hills, and they didn't sit down at tables. They would go up and walk and process things on foot. And the mind, when the blood is moving and the body is moving, but at a measured pace, not at a frantic pace, it really opens up thought. And I have found that to be very clarifying for me, as the insignificant parts sort of shake off, and the essence of what I'm meant to retain from the text becomes clear, almost kind of glowing, and I'm grateful for that discipline.
It's reminding me, I feel like, I can't quote chapter and verse, but I feel like there's several instances in the Gospels of Jesus teaching disciples while they're on their way, type thing, right? Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. We just had the Transfiguration Sunday, and they went up on the mountain to pray. And it wasn't just Jesus; it was James and John, and they went with him up. And it was after a period of time of walking together, and I'm sure talking and having some quiet time and moving to a different perspective. That's when they saw him in a new way.
There's a sermon right there. Good.
I've given that sermon, actually.
Yeah, well, that's good. I like it. I'm intrigued. Well, I had Jeff on to talk about his book, Part-Time is Plenty, Thriving Without Full-Time Clergy. And I really have been looking forward to this conversation because, frankly, I am an ordained pastor who wants to have a full-time job, but I also see the realities of the economics in our future. I'm hopefully, before this comes out, will have graduated with an MBA, which I did so for the purposes of diversifying my skill sets and, economic earning potential. That being said, I read the book very cynically, or at least with a tinge of cynicism, Jeff, wanting to disprove and dismiss the book. But as I said before we started recording, you touched on every I think, issue that I had primarily. So I'm looking forward to talking about that with you. And for our listeners, this is not the most controversial topic we've talked about, because as we already discussed offline, Jeff is a Red Sox fan and I'm a Yankees fan, and we're still somehow able to come together in Christian unity despite our differences.
It's a miracle.
It is a miracle. Well, I'll hold my tongue here. Talk about, if you can, what inspired the book.
Well, I was in a pastorate after having been ordained for 15 years. I found myself in a pastorate that was especially intense in its situation, in its circumstances, because it had, while I'd always served in part-time ministries since I was ordained in 2000, this was 2014 when I started at this other church, and they had abruptly gone from full-time to 10 hours a week
Wow.
in their pastorate. Yeah. They basically stuck with full-time until the very end, and when they called me, they said, we're getting ready to wind the church down. We think we're going to close in about 2 months. This is a church that's been around since 1635.
Wow.
And yeah, and they're like, we're out of money. We're closing up. Will you come and do a last few services for us? And it was during that process that they realized that actually they didn't want to close and didn't need to close if they could transition to a different model and make a few other significant belt tightening changes. And so the inspiration for the book came from my really trying to get up to speed over the first couple years on how do you do this well? How does the congregation have impact? How do the people mature as followers of Christ and witness and really develop and grow when the pastor doesn't have much time for much of anything except preparing and leading worship services?
Yeah.
Maybe attending one meeting a month or one Bible study a month, but it's pretty limited what you can do from the pastoral standpoint. And when I saw that there were basically no books on the subject, there are books on part-time ministry, but it's more about how to balance multiple jobs and family, and it's from a pastor's perspective, how the congregation can adjust its orientation to be partners for the pastor. That was not developed. And so I proposed a grant to the BTS Center in Portland, Maine. I said I would like to go learn from congregations that have made this transition, from mainline Protestant churches that have made the adjustment, and I would like to learn from those that are doing better, not worse, after making the change. Would you give me funding to go and visit them, learn from them, write articles, and perhaps write a book? And they said yes to my proposal, and I spent a year doing research, and the book is the result of that.
Yeah. So there's a lot of interesting points I want to hear about and highlight here. One that I think stood out to me for sure, just starting off, is about 43% of mainline churches have part-time clergy, and book was published, 2020, 2019? So
yes, 2020.
It's not inconceivable that number has gone up, correct?
Right. It's very likely. I mean, we're now in 2022. We've been in pandemic for 2 years. So many changes have happened. It's very possible that number is higher, and very possible that it now exceeds 50%.
Which is just mind-boggling to me. Perhaps it shouldn't be, and that's the point you're trying to make, though, that more than half, I think, or close to half at least, of mainline churches have part-time clergy. And the biggest point I think you're trying to make in the book is that use the word that part-time is not a kiss of death. And I don't know if you want to talk through that kind of false assumption and why you think that is a false notion.
Sure. what I found in visiting churches is they often have come to believe that it is the kiss of death, or could be, because that's what they've been taught,
Yeah.
largely from their denominational leaders and from their peers. Is they say, "Oh, you don't want to go to part-time clergy. You want to keep the position full-time as long as you possibly can, because that's the draw. That's the golden goose. That's what is enabling you to provide programming that people want to come and experience. And when you cut back, you're going to you won't be able to offer as much, and the church will just be on a path to decline and eventual closure." That's really not true. It Unfortunately, the way it sometimes plays out is that a church will believe that idea, and so they will hang on to their full-time clergy, like my church did in Newbury, Massachusetts. Hold on way too long.
Yeah.
Hold on to full-time long after you can afford to do it, where you're drawing down endowment funds or you're borrowing against your building in order to pay. And so they'll hold on way too long. And by the end of that, they've run out of money. Sometimes they've run out of people, or if they still have people, the people are too burned out and too far along in years to have the energy to share meaningfully in the ministry. And then they finally shrug their shoulders and go reluctantly to part-time clergy. And of course, they have nothing to work with. They have very little to work with anymore. And
Yeah.
so it does decline. And then the denomination says, "Look, see, we told you so. It doesn't work." That's a red herring. It actually can work very well when a congregation sees what it needs to do and makes the transition. Sometimes you go from full-time to three-quarter time,
Yeah.
and the congregation barely notices.
Yeah.
And yet you're making some intentional and strategic moves that are empowering the lay people to share the ministry in a meaningful and spiritually healthy way. So you can see that happening, and sometimes they're intentional about it. Sometimes they'll plan for a year or a year and a half before they begin to make the transition to three-quarter or half time. And so what I've seen is dozens of examples where it does work, because they've taken a whole new approach to doing church and doing ministry together. They haven't just lopped off half the pastor's job and said, "All right, we're going to continue as if that never happened." They're not doing that. They're rethinking, how do we minister together? And that's where the real awakenings and growth happens.
Yeah, so I'm intrigued by this because, again, I'm thinking as someone who served as a full-time pastor about all the stuff that can and should, I guess, be done throughout the week by a pastor. Everything from community outreach to home visitation to obviously worship leading, worship planning, sermon preparation, meetings, Bible studies. I mean, the list obviously goes on and on and on. I don't know if you want to talk about this because you have a 3 models of part-time clergy. So I don't know if you want to engage in that right now, but I'm curious, like, what are some things that like a pastor that shouldn't be sacrificed in the name of part-time clergy? Does that make sense?
Yes. Well, there's basically a renegotiation that goes on in a healthy situation where the lay people and the pastor do some rethinking of the pastorate and some restructuring of it. And so it's an important point here is that when the decline happens, as folks told me on the synod and that level of ministry, on the judicatory level, what they have seen on this is that, in fact, some of them tell me, the reason part-time doesn't work is because the pastor only has time for planning and leading worship and doing pastoral care with an older congregation usually, and that takes up all their time. And so you don't have any bandwidth left to do the things that generate the lifeblood, to be present in the community, to be building relationships with the scouting troops and the other folks who use the building, and to be serving on boards, and to be out there leading mission projects that partner with other organizations, and thereby building relationships that lead to folks visiting church and getting involved. And it's a good point, but it assumes that all you can do is sort of lop off all these things that the pastor would do if they were full time.
Yeah.
Instead, there's what I see churches doing when they transition is they strategically support the lay people to do some of what the pastor used to do, and they don't just leave them hanging. They share the ministry and they empower them with the resources and the training and the support that they need, so that folks are doing ministries that they find very meaningful, and that transition into a type of church that is more a fulfillment of what we would read about in places like 1 Corinthians 12, that talks about the Spirit being distributed among members of the body, not all consolidated in the head.
Yeah. Well, tell me about, you have in the book the 3 models of part-time clergy, and kind of give a brief overview of what those look like.
Sure. The models that I saw as a matter of discerning patterns from my research in the fields, these models that I saw were in churches of all types, suburban, urban, multiple denominations. The first one is the equipping model, which is one in which the pastor, instead of doing services or sort of providing goods and services as a provider or a dispenser of ministry, is teaching the people how to do more of the ministry arts. And so you see the pastor equipping, for instance, lay people to lead a Bible study rather than doing it himself or herself. So that can save a lot of time for the pastor, even if the pastor is quite hands-on with it, working with a few leaders. And you can see the same with preaching, that if a pastor can take a Sunday off each month, which I have seen a number of churches do, the pastor takes a Sunday off each month, that pastor just gained 10 to 13, 14 hours.
Right.
That's a big chunk of gain. And there's a lot you can do with that. That's almost, that's a day and a half of work. You can be involved in a lot of different types of activities in town or in the church when you do that. And so how do you get there? How do you not sacrifice the quality of preaching and the quality of worship leadership? Equipping is part of how you can do that. And so that's where the pastor takes those who have a gift. Sometimes it's teachers who know how to speak in front of people. So they take them and they say they're not afraid to speak in front of people. They can speak in front of middle schoolers. My goodness, of course they can speak in front of church people. And they use those transferable skills and people's passions and gifts and give them some of the basics in how to prepare a sermon, and that can take a few different forms. We can talk about that further, but that's the concept behind the equipping pastor, to teach the people to do pastoral care, to do preaching, to do evangelism, and so forth. Second model is the ambassador model, which is one in which as one pastor told me, the lay people run the church, basically, was how he put it, that they put together most of what is going to happen in worship. They kind of organize it, they get it together, they apportion the positions. They're just not dependent on a professional to kind of do it all for them. They put a lot of that together themselves, and then and in some cases they might share. There's different ways that they get it done, but the concept here though is that when you have lay people who can do a lot in the church, the pastor can be freed up. Like in that example where you take one Sunday a month and the pastor is freed up from planning and leading worship, the pastor can strategically be out doing those things that I was just talking about that generate the lifeblood. And so you strategically take that chunk of the pastor's time each month and you deploy it so that the pastor is involved in those areas where it's most promising, where if you're in a retirement community, you can send the pastor over to lead a Bible study at a facility where folks don't have a chaplain or a ministry presence, but or at a military base. You can send the pastor over to get to know the people there and be a presence and maybe take part in some life, some part of the life there, and there's so much that can come from that. So that's the idea. There's many different ways that the ambassador could do that. So that's the second model. And the third is the multi-staff model, where you have a part-time pastor and you have another part-time person who will, or more than one other part-time person, and they're sharing the load. I can say more if you want to hear about how that works, but it's essentially kind of specialization, and it doesn't require as much of the lay people stepping in. But it's a reallocation. It's strategic. It gives the pastor time for other work outside the church, and can be a win-win for congregations, both urban and I've seen it done in rural settings too.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to hear more, but there's more questions I want to ask you here. Plus, I want to give people a reason to buy the book, right? So you do develop that more, I think, in the book. This is something you mentioned earlier, and it's something that I've noticed. I remember, so I'm currently serving right now as a hospital chaplain, and I think you use this example in your book about denominational meetings happening like during the day, and I think you participating in some denominational activity that happened like in the evening or something, and you were like the only pastor there, and it was a bunch of chaplains, which you weren't, it wasn't that you didn't want to be with chaplains, but you're just noting how denominational systems and structures are set up for full-time clergy. I know in my own context, I think in the summer, there was like a revitalization conference that my denomination hosted, but it was, again, like Monday through Thursday when I was working. I would have loved to be a part of it and talk about revitalization, but working during the week as a chaplain, it wasn't even a possibility. So talk about, I don't know, it's a big thing. I don't know how much you want to dive in here about denominational systems and structures set up for the full-time model.
Yeah, it is a big thing. It's built on a premise that's what clergy do. We would have a covenant day in my region for all the clergy to come and kind of be together and meet with the conference minister. This was always on a Tuesday from 8 to 1 during the day. I could never go.
Yeah.
Because I was always working on my other job, and same was true for all the other part-time clergy. And there's a growing number of us, and so you get you feel that you're not really being seen by the denomination, or that you're not really being understood, and then all your people are not really understood either, or that you just don't matter, and or don't matter enough to adjust the schedule. Full-time clergy could get there on a Tuesday night, but they don't do that. They reserve that for meetings with their lay people who are working during the day. Well, what about us who work during the day? And so, yeah, there are many examples, and it goes beyond that to systems that I know of candidates who have been pressured to leave their jobs. Those who have worked in secular employment and are seeking to be ordained can be pressured to say, you really need to quit that job as a software programmer, or as a software engineer, or as a teacher, or whatever else you're doing, because that's what a really committed person in ministry would do.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
those are systems and biases that are absurd in a world where almost half, or perhaps more than half of congregations need part-time clergy. So it just comes from this, like, this idea of what commitment means that is just completely antiquated and just not real. That those who serve part-time are every bit as committed as full-time people. They just are serving in the right capacity for that congregation. Just like if you're a parent, if you go off to work, does that and you're with your kids, only a few hours in the evening, does that make you less committed to your kids? Does that mean you're not you're a part-time parent, and therefore just like, no, nobody would say that. So there's a lot to say on this, but I'm sure you have other questions.
Yeah. I think I see another side of it too, Jeff, is, from my perspective, at least, middle judicatories tend to ask a lot of pastors to serve on denominational boards and committees and roles, which again is going to be harder and harder for part-time pastors. So there needs to be, perhaps maybe your next book, Jeff, can be, for denominational leaders about adjusting to the new realities of part-time clergy and economics. So I'll have you on if you ever write that book again.
Yeah, thank you, Lauren. It's a lot of what I do in the consulting work I do is working with the judicatories to help them to help them be a support for congregations that they haven't always understood, and it's very important. But there's tons of opportunity here, which is really worth noting as well. That these are flexible congregations. These are congregations that do. That are resilient, that are innovative. They are used to rolling with a variety of circumstances, and they're right-sized for clergy who have other interests in life, other passions, other streams. There's a lot of talk about work-life balance and about being a multifaceted person, not just being kind of a one-dimensional person, or just being defined 100% by the job of the desk that you sit at Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. Our world has, there are 57 million freelancers in America, according to the Freelancers Union. That's about a third of the workforce. That is a huge amount of people, and these are self-employed people in everything from the trades to the arts. And when they can work part-time in the church and serve the church and receive a steady paycheck, it's not enough to pay all their bills. Okay, well, then they have another area. They have time to go and work in their other area and structure their day so that they can pick their kids up at school and still prepare their sermon for Sunday and still ply their trade or work in the arts as a writer, as a dancer, as a musician, as an artist, as a as a plumber or a coder. Our churches need to catch up with what's happened in the world of work and make room for these congregations to thrive. They can do it. They're ready to do it. but sometimes the denomination needs to just kind of adjust to help them and accommodate where they're already going.
One example I've been giving a lot of thought to as I search for my next call is like I'd rather be like 30 hours a week making like a healthy wage, like a really respectable, healthy wage, than getting a quote unquote full-time salary that's really not commensurate for the cost of living in my context. But then, like you said, that would free me up to have the family flexibility or other income flexibility type things. So let me shift this a little bit, because this is the most cynical side of me was reading this book, thinking about you, and you touch on these things, and this is what I appreciated. But the big challenges I see them are student debt, finding healthcare, especially if you have a family. What do you think that churches and denominations can do for someone who goes to seminary and takes out 50, 100K in debt? I don't know what, because it's a bigger problem than you can probably discuss and you address, but probably can discuss in the book. What are your thoughts just though here?
Yeah, it's a very important question, Lauren, and there are two parts of it. I think one is, what do we do with those who have already taken on the debt?
Right.
And then
right.
what do we do going forward?
Yeah.
For those who have already accumulated the debt and have felt like they need full-time work to justify that or to pay it off, I would like to see denominations do the best they can by those students, helping them if they can't find a full-time pastorate that works for their financial needs, then to help them put together a couple of pastorates, if that's to see that possibility, to help them do that if they feel called to full-time equivalent ministry. It might be in more than one setting, and we do see more and more of that.
Yeah.
Another possibility is to help them to train to transfer their ministry skills, their theological training, and other work background, which many people have, and educational background, to repurpose those skills, to transfer those skills, or to learn new skills that they can do alongside the ministry if they have really been counting on a church employment landscape that just no longer exists. Then the denomination could help them in that type of approach. The denomination can't just lean on local congregations and say, look, you have an endowment. You need to spend that on a full-time salary for that person, even if it means going into the red year after year. That is not that is not a fair thing to expect of a local church. That's presumptuous of the various futures that these churches are trying to navigate. And so that's something I would say on that. And then in the future, making theological education much more affordable is really key so that debt levels don't go high, and also using our theological education resources to train lay people as well as clergy, train them in specific areas to be pastoral counselors, to be Stephen ministers, to be evangelists, to be lay preachers. We need to stop putting all this hefty theological and expensive education on just one person in the congregation. That's lunacy, and it's irresponsible stewardship, and it doesn't fit with where the world and the church are going.
Yeah. Two examples in my context of this I want to highlight. So my pension fund, the Christian Church, I know they have a program specifically, like you mentioned, of some like job training or like interview coaching. I'm not sure what the word is, but to help transfer your pastoral skills into like a quote unquote secular job context, so you can get a part-time job if you need to, rather than God bless Amazon, but working at Amazon for $15 an hour is kind of rough when you've got a master's of Divinity tax or debt bill. And another example, my seminary, Phillips Theological Seminary, they have I think it's a pretty good burgeoning like kind of lay training that's very affordable. I know in one context I sent a couple students their way, for that training. So I think those are two great examples, and I'm sure there are many others of denominational and kind of institutions doing work on this level. One other kind of hard question I do need to ask you is, and maybe again this is just my own bias as like a fairly quote unquote younger-ish pastor with kids and a family, I would love to be in a context where I could get full-time benefits. So this is from my bias and context. Like, I feel like in some contexts, this might push out young clergy, or churches might just be like, oh, you know what? Let's just go to part-time because it's cheaper and we can find someone cheaper, and that's going to edge out someone looking for a full-time job. What are your thoughts there?
Well, I think I understand that concern, and thinking about for part-time and for younger clergy, that if they're looking for full-time work and need that amount of income, they may be trying to find it in the church and can do so. I think I'd refer back to my to my prior answer as well, though. I think a lot of it has to do with the openness to serve in more than one setting. That's increasingly common. That people value ministry skills. They just don't need or afford or can't afford you at that in one setting. So you have to work in multiple settings, and that's an important part, or work in multiple fields to serve in ministry and whatever else you do, teaching or doing something with a different part of your brain, or a different part of your body, whatever your skill sets are and your passions are. So I just think that it's a lot of it has to do with expectations, and it's and for young people to be hoping that the church is going to provide a livelihood in one area, and in one setting, go to one church and stay at that one church and earn enough to pay for yourself and your spouse and your benefits and all of that. It's a little bit like, in some of the Rust Belt towns, kind of hoping that the factory job that was there in the 1950s and 60s is going to reopen, or is going to stay open, or provide the livelihood for you. It's just the two phenomena are actually quite related, and it's just not an economic reality at this point. But there's plenty of opportunity in ministry for young people. You just have to look at it as one part of what you do. It's not the ticket to your entire livelihood to be in one setting, in one ministry, but rather to recognize that for the majority of church history and in the majority of the world today, ministry is something that people do alongside something else. Even in the medieval days, it was something that you had priests, but they were not depending on that for their livelihood. They were working as clerks and administrators and other types of positions. It was more of a status, like being a notary or a justice of the peace. It wasn't necessarily like your livelihood. That's a more recent phenomenon, and it's arguably not going to be tenable long term to see it in such a narrow way, because sometimes we get biased by the post-war experience, and we say, we measure everything against the reality of like 1965. Well, that was more of an aberration than a new norm. It was a blip. It's gone, and yet the church has been around for 2,000 years and has a bright future. We just have to see the broader trends and be part of what the Holy Spirit's doing.
Yeah. Well, we're running long on time here, but I want to ask you one more question if I can before we take a break. maybe tell me real quick, where are some examples like this would work or like wouldn't work at all? Like church contexts where, a part-time clergy would work very well that you've seen, and then maybe church contexts where really shouldn't go after part-time. Like either they just need to close or they're not commit, they need to commit to full-time, that kind of thing. What are your thoughts there?
Well, yeah, I think that in cases, the part-time is most promising, I think, in cases where you do have a corpus of lay people who are excited to be partners in the ministry with the pastor. You don't need a ton of them, but you do need some who can see another way of being church together, who are excited to be practitioners more than they are to be consumers, to be players more than they are to be spectators. That's an important part of it. And if you have that kind of congregation, then you have probably the most valuable raw material in this equation for a very bright transition. And so those churches would do very well to do it. And you can, by the way, go to part-time temporarily, and you can go back to full-time if you need to. Of course, that affects the pastor's life, and the pastor has to be interested to do that. And you don't want to mess around with somebody's life if they can't,
Yeah.
unwittingly. But there is this. It doesn't have to be a permanent change if it just isn't workable for those churches that otherwise. But in some cases, a church has. I had served in a church that had an older population, a smaller population, a significant endowment, and they tried to go part-time, and it really wasn't something that they could be partners in. And so they decided to go back to a full-time arrangement. And I think it was probably the right thing for them because they had the resources to pay for it. They could be innovative in their approach and to how to do that, and it just seemed like the right thing for them.
Good. Well, let's take a quick break and we'll come back with some closing questions. All right, we're back with G. Jeffrey MacDonald, and these closing questions, I always tell folks you can take these as seriously or not as you'd like to, but if you're Pope for a day, what would you like to do with that day? That kind of thing.
Well, yeah, if I were Pope for a day, along these lines of what we're talking about, I would love to see just a showcasing of the vitality that exists in so many congregations. These are just gems on our landscape. They offer something like the smaller mainline congregations, thinking of those with fewer than 100 people in worship. Many have fewer than 50 in worship. They are bringing people together in communities where people are increasingly organized by affinities and by where only those who are like-minded are congregating together. So the churches are bringing people together across generations, across ideologies, in ways that are just incredibly valuable. And they're doing it in a small space where true relationships get built around following God through Jesus Christ. And it is just such a gem for our society. It's very much overlooked. It's taken for granted. And I would just love to see more celebration of the powerful ministries that congregations are doing together, and the liberation in a way of the lay people that we see in churches that have made these transitions. So that's probably what I would like to happen if I
Yeah.
were Pope for a day.
Yeah. I like that because I've heard this in other contexts too, that, at a conference, for instance, the speaker or highlighted or celebrated speaker is often a church pastor of a big, hundreds of thousands church. But we need to understand those are the exceptions. And by far the most common are the smaller churches.
Yeah. Yeah. I attended an event on church security one time, and the speaker was from one of the denomination's most affluent congregations. And he was talking about, this is what we do at our church. We have a security detail every Sunday at all
Right.
at all 6 entrances, and we have cameras, and we have hidden cameras, and everybody was just there like saying, that's nice, but we can't afford any of that. Like
Right.
when is this session going to be over? Because it's totally irrelevant to everything we're doing.
Yeah. This is, yeah. We'll move on, but that's a fun conversation for sure. A theologian or historical Christian figure you'd want to meet or bring back to life?
Yeah, I as someone from a different tradition than my own, who I'd love to talk to and learn from is John Wesley. I'm UCC myself, but I have so much appreciation for the resources of the Methodist Church, and the United Methodism is very generous with making those available. And I learned so much from the approach and just the sensibility of taking on of developing a method. He helped found a denomination that actually has method in the name, and thinks about being systematic about the making of disciples, and using, being practical, being innovative. The circuit riders was a emerged out of some of his vision, and that is extremely relevant for today. And so I'd love to know how John Wesley saw the landscape and the challenges that predated Methodism, and how he kind of brought his radical faith and his pragmatic intuition together to read the landscape and respond with something that's really nothing short of genius.
Yeah, that's an intriguing answer. It makes me want to learn more. What do you think history will remember from our current time and place?
We could see this as a time of, it's always hard to predict because we don't know while we're living it. But on one side, one way to see it is on a more negative side, we might see that there is a fracturing of much of what had held our society together, that we see some fragmentation, some tribalism, and regression in toward looking out for ourselves. Like that might be, and not looking out for our neighbor as much, and that might be a theme that. But that might be just a foil or a relief against which some truly wonderful new things emerge. And so although those are trends that we need to be concerned about, I'm also very hopeful that this would be a time where we would discover in the church world about that we finally, the priesthood of all believers became a reality in our time, that that people reclaimed the mantle that all of us are to be ministers, and not just leave that to a certain class of professionals, but would embrace something of the heart of the gospel in a way that maybe got confused or lost for a time there, but is returning in much of the way that we are recovering these days some knowledge around how to raise our own food, or how to do certain things for ourselves, and not always depend on professionals in so many areas of life. The pendulum might be swinging some, and that could be good for communities and relationships and discipleship.
Yeah. Well, you kind of addressed it there in your answer. Do you have anything else you want to share about your hope for the future of Christianity?
I do hope that we are in a time when the discipleship and the calling of ordinary people is appreciated more prominently. I think it's appreciated on a small scale, but I'm hopeful that just like there were times when the stories of the saints got organized and codified and lifted up and converted into forms that we could turn to and remember. I'm hopeful that will happen. That more of our exemplars will be recognized and will be developed as into the mature followers of Christ that they are meant to be, and to just really encourage that trajectory and let it be instructive for future generations. I think we're going in that direction. I think clergy have often had the spotlight, and some of our big, sort of celebrity figures in Christian leadership have kind of dominated, for better or for worse, often for worse. But I just think it's a flattening of the leadership in a way now, and a real in a way that's truly consistent with the biblical witness to the early church. And so I'm excited to see that development, and hopeful that we'll be able to live into it.
Yeah. I think as we're recording this today or yesterday, speaking of a big figure, problematic big figure in the church, I think Brian Houston of Hillsong, I think that's his name, just recently resigned. So certainly a sad example, timely example of that. Well, the book is Part-Time is Plenty, Thriving Without Full-Time Clergy. Highly recommend it. Written pre-COVID, and I think very relevant in our time. Tell our listeners, where they can get a copy of the book and how they can connect with you.
Sure. You can get a copy of the book through online channels, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. They all carry it. The publisher is Westminster John Knox Press. And you can find more about me at jeffreymacdonald.com. And yeah, that'll do it. Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate the conversation, and may God's peace be with you.
And also with you, Lauren.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. One more thing before you go. Do us a favor and subscribe to the podcast. And if you're feeling especially generous, leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people about the podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is a production of Torn Curtain Arts and Resonate Media. Our episodes were mixed by Danny Burton, and the production support is provided by Paul Romig-Levitt. Thanks, and go in peace.